today. Before we get started, I'm going to share a few quick APSAC updates. Just want to remind everyone, tomorrow, March 20th at 12 Eastern, we have part 4 of the APSAC Commission for Racial Justice Training on Contemporary Challenges with doctors Akeem Marsh and Brian Hodge. Christy will put that in the chat. Please register. We do have the colloquium in June in New Orleans, wonderful New Orleans, June 9th through 12th. Early bird registration ends April 1st. So make sure that you go ahead and get registered. We will be recording today, and there will be a question and answer at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Dejanay Brown. And thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hannah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining this presentation, our child welfare case outcomes, Black or White. This is a response to race disparities received by permanency professionals and caregivers of Black children. This presentation is a collaboration between the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign School of Social Work, who leads this research, and the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. My name the efforts to address and infuse race equity in child welfare. I am joined by my colleagues. We're trying to move the screen. It's not moving. We apologize. There you go. Thank you. Dr. Heather Fox and Dr. Katie Landa, and I'm going to allow themselves to introduce themselves to you.
Hi, I'm Heather Fox. I'm a senior research specialist with translational research. And I am one of 4 core members of this team, but you're going to see in a moment, there's a whole bunch of us. Another member of our team is Katie Landa.
As Heather said, I'm Katie Landa, and I'm research staff at the Children and Family Research within the University of Illinois School of Social Work. And Dejanay, could you introduce yourself one more time, because you were muted, so we couldn't. I don't think people could hear what you said.
Thank you. Dejanay Brown, the Director of Racial Equity Practice at DCFS. All right, thank you, Katie. So let's jump into the presentation. Why even focus on guardianship? So how many times have you heard a family member state they don't want to adopt their relative? They don't mind providing the long-term care, but not really willing to sever the relationships that a child may have with their parents. So in child welfare, adoption has always been the gold standard. And when providing permanency, when reunification was not possible. But we know because of implicit bias around the age of a child, the fear of relatives allowing a child to live with their parents, or even the assumption that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, guardianship is just not on the radar. It's not a considerable option for permanency. So looking at the inequities and permanency outcomes for Black children in foster care in Illinois, as you can see, Illinois is behind the national average on moving children to permanent homes within a year after being in foster care for 1 to 2 years, near at 22%. And while white children are represented in DCFS proportionally to the percentage of the general child population, Black children are overrepresented at over twice their percentage in the general population. So Black children have longer lengths of stay in foster care. And between 12 and 59 months, Black children are underrepresented in exiting care, but 60 months or better overrepresented, which means Black children linger in care for the term of what some folks have referenced to me, the length of a car note, 60 months, 60 months. And so as Black children are also underrepresented in achieving reunification and adoption. So they are also less likely to attain permanence. And because guardianship is not widely used for Black and white families alike, we think that guardianship could be a good permanency option for Black families, Black children. So as DCFS focuses on the utilization of guardianship in an effort to provide more permanency for children and families, understanding that extended stays in the child welfare system plays a huge impact on children well-being and well-becoming. It keeps the family unit together. And as you look at the quote, this is our Chief Deputy Director at DCFS. It describes how we need to honor the rights of children and families, as well as be the support that leads to the overall well-being and connectiveness of family. So interestingly, in the last couple of years, we've seen some changes, legislative changes that have supported equity through guardianship. In 2021, there was an amendment to the Juvenile Court Act that basically removed the requirement to rule out adoption before considering guardianship. It also entailed the courts confirming DCFS discussion with parents on adoption prior to changing the goal to guardianship. But now, caregivers, they have the opportunity to hear about both. And if they prefer guardianship, they're not pressured to adopt, which is, what we want for our families. And then in 2023, there was an amendment to our Child and Family Services Act that added guardianship as a suitable permanent family arrangement and mandates concurrent planning from the time of placement. So these legislative changes has and will become instrumental in Illinois' attempt to move the equity needle in child welfare. As well, DCFS is also committed to using research to improve equity in Illinois and look for opportunities that can better support system transformation with equity at the helm. Today we'll be discussing the guardianship study, but I also work with my colleagues here on the transracial placement and racial identity development study that is focusing on the cultural aspects of well-being of children, Black children specifically, placed in homes in predominantly all-white communities. We are also working with Chapin Hall, who will be doing research specific to elevating the family voice. Not only do we want to learn from lived experts, but we want them to be at the table and be a part of the decision-making process. We are also working with a young lady who's doing her dissertation and using the department in terms of looking at the nexus of poverty, place, race, and bureaucracy. And this will examine how county level poverty rates, urbanicity, and the racial composition may interact and influence policy implementation and service distribution. This is an opportunity to learn more about the practice versus the policy. We are always looking for opportunities to research and data to assist us in guiding the appropriate strategies and interventions necessary to change the organizational culture. So we understand the status quo. So we're trying to give families an opportunity not only to survive, but thrive and triumph. If any of you on this presentation are engaged in other types of research, I'm interested in hearing about it. Feel free to drop it in the chat. The more information we receive, more research is done, gives us a better opportunity to strategize real interventions that will move the needle for Black and brown families in the child welfare system. Next slide. Now I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Katie Blanda as we talk about the research and what they found. Katie?
Thanks, Dejanay. Next slide, please. Our research team, based in the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign School of Social Work, consists of staff from the Children and Family Research Center, the Office of Research and Child Wellbeing, and students, and one staff member from the School of Social Work. Next. Next slide, please. We worked with an active advisory team staffed by Department of Children and Family Services statewide administrators, including Dejanay, with expertise in the department's permanency planning, racial inequities, and data. Members of this advisory team had originally requested this research. Next slide. Our research focused on answering 4 questions. 1, what values, principles, and practices do professionals apply to choosing between adoption and guardianship for children and youth in foster care? 2, what factors facilitate and inhibit use of subsidized guardianship? 3, what are caregivers' views about guardianship and adoption? What is their experience with agencies regarding permanency planning? And 4, how does the race of children and their families affect permanency decision-making and processes? So we are presenting on our 4th research question today. Okay, next. We use mixed methods in this study by administering both interviews and surveys to different samples of permanency professionals and caregivers. We interviewed 13 permanency supervisors, 11 permanency caseworkers, 5 DCFS attorneys, 5 guardians ad litem, and 5 judges. And we surveyed 267 caseworkers and supervisors. We interviewed 11 long-term kin and fictive kin caregivers of Black children for whom the department had a goal of adoption or guardianship. And we surveyed 137 caregivers of at least one Black child placed with them by DCFS for at least a year who had a goal of adoption or guardianship. In the survey, the caregivers answered questions about 335 children in their care, of whom 78% were Black. Next. And we will now share our findings. Next slide. Among the caregivers we interviewed, 2 believe they may have experienced racism in their experience with the placement of the child and permanency planning. 1 Black caregiver thought her not receiving any information on guardianship or the progress of the case and not receiving any financial assistance in caring for the children may have been due to racism. Another Black caregiver said her sister, the child's parent, had said that racism had prevented the child's initial placement with kin. The mother was incarcerated and DCFS had not approached relatives to care for her daughter. When the mother learned this was contrary to agency policy, she successfully lobbied the judge to have her daughter placed with her sister. The aunt caregiver who we interviewed then proceeded to tell us about additional inappropriate casework practice that she felt may have stemmed from racism. She described that the traditional foster parent with whom the niece was originally placed was a caseworker of the agency that then placed the niece with the caregiver and continued to supervise the case. The aunt caregiver believed that the caseworker, who had been the child's foster parent, continued to compete with her for the child through the caseworker who was assigned to her niece. She explained, the caseworker had brought me the child, was connected to the caseworker who had been the child's foster parent. So when I first got the child, they were like white on rice. The caseworker assigned to the case told me that the child could be with my mom, who has my sister's other 2 children. So I took her one day to my mom's house. The caseworker who had been the foster parent sent the police to my mom's house to get child because she said that child wasn't supposed to be in nobody's care but mine. And there was a big argument with me and the caseworker who had told me that she could be with my mom. He kept saying he didn't tell me that. I think they was trying to get child back. I raised such a big deal about it that they ended up getting rid of that caseworker for me and sending somebody else. So this caregiver also related that she felt racism may have been the cause of inappropriate questions about family drug use and an incident of her husband's that had occurred about 30 years earlier. She said, I feel even when the caseworker came over to my house in the beginning, he was being very stereotypical. Maybe because my son had a Bob Marley poster on his wall, he made a reference to us smoking marijuana and how we couldn't. And I said, nobody here smokes marijuana. And I thought it was strange. The guy was questioning my husband about a case from the 90s. I don't know if that's protocol, but we felt like we were under the examining gun a little too hard. Next slide. Among the professionals we interviewed, a few discussed racial inequities they had observed in the child welfare system or courts. Here are 2 examples. Kids of color linger longer in the foster care system. They don't achieve permanency, and that can be either return home or adoption or guardianship. A lot of times the hoops that families have to jump through because people do have biases. There's not a whole lot of cultural competency. I've overall seen Caucasians treated very differently from Hispanics and Blacks in all aspects: guardianship, return home, or adoption. Caucasian families get their children home more often and quicker than Blacks and Hispanics. Like the young Black man, he did everything we asked him to, and the court decided to do a guardianship instead of sending his child home with him. Caucasians are able to afford a private attorney. If you have a private attorney, you're looked at differently and treated differently. Next slide. Several permanency professionals we interviewed share perceptions of Black families' preferences for caring for children whose parents cannot care for them. One permanency supervisor said, "People of color like to keep their roles. Even though grandma raised you, that's still grandma." A second said, "There is an understanding that the grandmothers who usually take these kids on, or the aunts or uncles, don't want to terminate the bond between the parent and the child, so they choose guardianship." A third said, "In my experience, Black and Hispanic families are more willing to consider guardianship. A lot of times I think that the sense of family and community in terms of raising children is slightly different, such that they're willing to consider guardianship when other families are not." And now next slide, and I'll turn it over to Heather.
Sorry. One of the things we learned from our survey results is how much more likely Black professionals were to be aware of inequities in the permanency process for Black children. We asked permanency professionals about any differences they perceived in permanency planning for Black and white families. The top three differences were that white children were more likely to be reunified than Black children in comparable families, that white children were reunified more quickly, and that courts gave Black birth parents less time than white birth parents before moving to terminate parental rights. Note, however, that there's a statistically significant difference in the proportion of Black permanency professionals who noted these differences. We asked permanency professionals about any differences they perceived in the use of guardianship and adoption between Black and white families. The top four differences were that Black families were more likely to experience challenges in advocating for their children and their family, that more Black families have difficulty meeting the requirements for guardianship subsidies, that Black families are more likely to have extended family members who are open to providing permanency for them, and that Black families are more likely to favor guardianship over adoption. Note that there was a statistically significant difference in the proportion of Black permanency professionals who noted all of these differences as well. Here we shift to our caregivers' perspectives. There were also a significant difference in the ratings of Black and white caregivers when we asked about their perceptions of judges and caseworkers. We found that Black caregivers, as compared to white caregivers, rated both judges and caseworkers as less comfortable working with Black families, less effective working with Black families, not respecting Black fathers, demanding more from Black family members, and focusing too much on what's happened in the past, like our previous case, referencing a case that was 30 years old, for Black family members. Black caregivers, as compared to white caregivers, rated caseworkers, but not judges, approach to working with Black families as less culturally appropriate. We believe that this indicates that, as with Black professionals, Black caregivers are more attuned to the racial inequities in the permanency process. We provided caregivers with the following statement in the survey. Implicit racial bias happens when people make assumptions about race, have racial stereotypes, or do hurtful things based on race even if they don't mean to. Often people act on implicit bias without realizing it. Our implicit bias can go against our values. Then we asked them, how much do you think that judges and caseworkers' implicit racial bias affected planning for a permanent home for the children in your care? They were asked to rate this on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 means that they think that the implicit racial bias had no effect, and a 10 means that they feel that the implicit racial bias had a major effect. While the largest proportion of caregivers responded little or no effect, over half of the caregivers indicated that there was some level of effect, be it from weak to major. 31% of caregivers indicated that racial implicit bias of the judges had a strong to major effect on planning for a permanent home for the children in their care. 26% of caregivers indicated that racial implicit bias of their caseworkers had a strong to major effect on planning for a permanent home for the children in their care. Compared to white caregivers, Black caregivers reported a larger effect of the implicit biases held by both judges and caseworkers for their children in their care. I'm going to hand it back over to Katie.
Several of the professionals we interviewed talked about the racial biases that professionals themselves experience in permanency work. A Black DCFS attorney told us, on my first day in this court, the bailiff, when I was going through security, was shocked that I was an attorney. They had never seen a Black attorney in their court. The bailiff proceeded to ask me how long I was going to be there. I said, I think there are 5 cases up. And he said, okay, just make sure you're out of town before it gets dark. Then the judge could not get it in his head that I was actually an attorney. Several interviewees spoke of clients' reactions to race. A white caseworker shared, I remember when I was an intern and I went out on an investigation with an African-American female who had been in the field for years. I was a 20-something-year-old intern, and when we went out to the home, they would turn to me and start talking to me like I was the authority. You know that the response you get is going to be different. Next slide. Another topic that arose in interviews with professionals was the underrepresentation of Black professionals among permanency professionals. A caseworker expressed concern about the consequences of this underrepresentation on cultural competence. There needs to be greater representation of a variety of people making these decisions. Social workers, attorneys, judges, they need to look like these kids that they're taking into care. The majority of these kids are children of color, and the majority of people making decisions for these children are not. I think that's problematic. I think we need to dismantle this systematic savior complex that I think DCFS is trying to implement. What they believe is the perfect family structure is based on the predominant culture, which is white culture, and they impose it on other cultures. Another Black attorney practicing in several counties emphasized how unusual it was to see a Black attorney in most of the counties she practiced in. Quote, I've never seen anybody practicing in that courtroom that looks like me. County A, no. County B, I think I've seen maybe 1 other Black attorney, maybe 2. County C, no. County D, definitely no. County E, no. I've seen a couple of African-American or minority attorneys in County F, a couple in County G. There's quite a few in County H, I, J, and K, but from Chicago West, it's less. Next slide. In the survey of permanency caseworkers and supervisors, 43% indicated that they did not perceive a difference in the child welfare system of supports for Black and white families. However, almost half of those surveyed indicated that there was not sufficient availability of services in communities or neighborhoods with large proportions of Black families. 31% said there was an underrepresentation of Black permanency professionals, and about a quarter indicated there were insufficient resources for Black birth parents and for Black caregivers. Professionals could also write in comments on the survey, and one said, "We need more African-American child welfare professionals at the table to discuss racial biases associated with Black children in care. This includes the lack of resources for Black biological parents, specifically fathers being considered as the reunified parent, and other systemic issues that adversely affect permanency outcomes for Black children." Another wrote in my experience, families of color are expected to have a case in the system. However, people are shocked when a Caucasian family has a case. I've seen this with some of my coworkers who have created excuses for white parents who are not meeting requirements, but have an eagle eye on a Black family. This appeared to be an unrecognized bias, but it was disturbing to witness. Next slide. In the interviews, we asked the kin and fictive kin caregivers of Black children about the difficulties they experienced in caring for the children. Their answers provided insight into the types of supports that are needed. 3 of the caregivers talked about challenges they faced in addressing severe trauma experienced by the children they cared for. Others indicated a need for support with navigating relationships with the children's parents and a need for help with their own grieving for the separation of the children and parents from one another. Some were emphatic about the need for more supports with parenting of the children. One interviewee told us that the reason he decided to participate in the study was because he wanted DCFS to know that there are not enough supports for parenting. He said, quote, "Right now it's just placement warehousing." Next slide. And we're going back to Heather.
So on that same theme, we asked caregivers in the survey what resources they would find the most helpful for caring for Black youth. And they were provided with the 6 options shown here on this slide. There was strong support for all of these options provided, with over 40% of caregivers indicating an extreme need for each of these resources. There was a significant difference in the need for each support reported by Black and white caregivers, except in the case of providing support for children dealing with racism, which was rated equally high by both white and Black caregivers. So we're going to switch here and start talking about recommendations based on the selection of findings that we've covered today. In our study, we put our recommendations into 3 categories. These are big general categories, and we have them written out in detail in the report you see on the screen, where is our policy context and lessons learned report. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them to give you an idea of what's in each category, but I encourage people who are interested in thinking about how they could make change around guardianship to go look at the report and see these recommendations in detail. The first is to reduce barriers to permanency. This includes recommendations to conduct a process assessment of permanency practices that are related to adoption and guardianship. The development of safeguards to reduce delays in progress towards permanency that is caused by caseworker turnover, and increasing the availability of services needed to prepare for different permanency options. The second recommendation option is providing education about guardianship and publicly celebrating guardianships. Here we recommended a statewide education campaign for permanency professionals, which the department is working on. We're really excited to be part of, and we'll talk about soon. We suggested communicating with judicial and legal permanency professionals, and also to build recognition and celebration across the state and with the general population around guardianship. The third area, improve racial equity in the permanency processes for Black children and families, I'll talk about in more detail because it's the subject of today's webinar. So we had several recommendations from our study findings to improve racial equity for Black children and families in permanency outcomes. These recommendations relate to capacity building and training of permanency professionals in culturally competence and cultural humility, and leading with diversity, equity, and inclusion principles with all staff. It is important to honoring the voices of Black professionals who are grounded in thought and thoughtful in connecting with Black children and families, and the perspectives of Black families and youth who are impacted by the child welfare system. We need to increase access and supports for Black families to access behavioral health, substance abuse, and parenting supports, and often recognize the economic, housing, and childcare barriers that contribute to children being able to be safely at home or with family, and the lack of supports that are structural. So let's consider ways we can utilize strategies like child and family team meetings, wraparound, and other evidence-based services to help parents and family, and invite the building collaborative solutions with our families. Race equitable practice is not new. However, the need is great for renewed learning community around fostering race equity and permanency planning and engaging in open conversation. The more we talk about it, like today, the more practice we become and more comfortable we are in working together on race inequities. I'm going to pass it back to Dejanay to talk about some of the great things that the department is working on.
Thank you, Heather. So, want to shift and talk about some of DCFS efforts to improve utilization of guardianship. In Illinois, we have, Heather just referenced it, a Child Welfare Advisory Committee. And of that bigger committee, there are subcommittees. One is a racial equity, specific to racial equity. I have the opportunity to co-chair the subcommittee, along with some of our contributing child welfare agency partners. CASA folks sit on this space, and some lived experts that focus specifically on race equity strategies that include one, identifying a race equity curriculum for all child welfare staff. And so we're in the process of hopefully identifying versus develop, but we want to, we provided an implicit bias training to all of our staff in 2020. And now we're moving to the race equity space. And so we're looking to have a race equity curriculum for all child welfare staff in Illinois. We've also had the opportunity in this particular committee to develop a race equity assessment toolkit. And that toolkit is designed to be used with our teams, our divisions, and our child welfare contributing agencies, allowing them to identify a root cause specific to their role. There's a different number of different roles across child welfare, but specific to the role that an individual is doing, we want them to think about one test of change that they can do in their space. And so that race equity is not housed in my office, but that race equity is infused across the department. The other thing we're getting ready to roll out is our implicit bias campaign. And so our implicit bias campaign is kind of like an educational tool that what we want to do. We're looking for production folks. We're getting our script together because what we want to do is focus on targeting our top 3 mandated reporters, which probably similar to some folks in other jurisdictions, but that's our law enforcement, our medical professional, and our schools, of course. And we want that the theme about that PSA is if this child were mine, yours. And we're looking to roll that out this year. And finally, this work group is also reviewing the neglect allegations. There's a lot of work we see in other states, some changes to be made. And so we're trying to look at our legislation that's being done to determine if we can also have potential changes in our state legislation that helps close that front door. Also, we have a statewide communications PSA. So this is a relationship with our communications division and our permanency division that have collaborated around building awareness on guardianship utilization. The idea around this campaign is to, one, dispel the myths that are attached to guardianship. So here's an example of a flyer, and we'll have that information to share with you after our presentation. But here's some of the things you can see. Is guardianship stable? There's always questions about guardianship being less stable than adoption. Well, the evidence shows that after 5 years, there's only a slight difference in the stability of adoption versus guardianship. But again, which does ECFS prefer? How do we communicate that as an agency to all the staff? We want what's best, the best interest for the child, what's the best interest for the family. Do we have to rule out adoption? So I talked earlier about the change in legislation. No, we don't have to rule out adoption. That's not a standard anymore. And then what are the eligibility for guardianship subsidies? And so this is being used to share across our department as we work on engaging more of our staff and moving toward the guardianship as a permanency goal for Black children. Also, we're working to strengthen our permanency enhancement project. So really briefly, our permanency enhancement project is a collaborative with university partners across the state and what we call community action teams. And what our university partners help support us in doing is providing data to those community action teams. So these are organizations within particular communities across the state of Illinois who have, using a race equity lens, looking to identify strategies and interventions that help close the front door and also get families back home in a timely fashion. And so in our using this method, we want to make sure we have get the information out to the communities, because communities know what they need, right? They're in their own community. They look at the data, which is a great thing. We use the data for them to look at and see what's happening in terms of Black kids coming into the system, what they can do to address that. And I know due to different administrative changes, both at the state level and the department level, this program had really lost its momentum and not well supported. But as of recent, we've been able to increase the level of funding for this program with our federal funds through the executive order that the president made a few years ago. We've been able to double their budget, and that allows them to provide technical support to the community action teams, helping with plan development, capacity building, and as well, execution of activities. Some of the activities they've done is going out and talking to schools when they see a big number in the amount of calls being made by the school system, right? They'll get together and put a presentation together and come and talk about how many of those cases that they made calls on actually really turned into investigations, and also sharing other resources in the communities where those schools are located to help, those persons, teachers and the like, to think about, the kid needs some food and if the kid needs clothes, that's great. Let's get them connected to some community resources versus calling the department and starting an investigation. And then in addition to our PEP, we have begun to permanency enhancement project. I'm sorry, we use acronyms a lot. We have begun exploration into the barriers associated with family finding. And so like with other many things, when you start digging, we end up finding that this is a practice issue. We are, as we had discussed transracial placements earlier in the presentation, it is our thought that children should be with their families. So this will minimize the issues that we have with foster parents being culturally competent and having cultural sensitivity. So some of the barriers that we have found as a result are reluctance for families to disclose the information. It's like, why do you want my information? I'm trying to help with a family member, but you're kind of digging deep into, my family dynamics. And why do you need that information? Barriers in trust issues with the worker and investigator. So a lot of times that's a very contentious space when investigators showing up to talk about child removal. And so building that relationship there has created, not being able to create a relationship there has created barriers in, identifying family members to help keep kids from entering the system or finding relative placements for children to be placed with. And then families who are unable to provide caregiving. So because of health issues, financial issues, maybe the background issue is always a concern, maybe not enough space in the home to accommodate the needs. These are we found to be barriers in placing our children with family and relatives. And then on the internal end, on the DCFS side of that, it's just delays in locating family. If we can do it earlier in the case versus later in the case, we can potentially keep kids from coming in the system, or again, place them immediately with family. So in November 2023, we also conducted our very first survey to understand employees' perceptions of cultural competency within the agency. And these results will be used to develop a plan for improving cultural competency, as well as serve as a baseline for measuring change. So we plan to conduct this survey annually. We want to identify areas of improvement. We want to make sure that, our workers are the folks that go out and talk to our children. So we want to talk to our families. So we want to make sure that they're culturally competent in communicating with one another, as well, being able to communicate with our families that they go and see and speak to as a part of their daily work. So I think that is all I have. Okay, now I'll pass it back to Heather.
Actually, we're going back to Kate.
Oh, we're going back to Katie. Sorry, Katie.
No problem. So we need the next slide. So we want to share with you where you can find our study briefs and reports, if you'd like to read them. We've placed them all, reports and briefs, the interviews and surveys of professionals and caregivers, and a report detailing the policy context and recommendations on a study website. This slide provides both the URL for the study website and a code that you can scan into your smartphone camera to access it. And I think I'll turn it back to Hannah now for questions.
Hannah, do we have any questions? Because we wanted to preserve that last 15 minutes to answer any questions people have.
Yes, there are a few questions. So first, I know the PDF of the slides will be shared, but will the toolkit will the toolkits be shared? Will the toolkit reference be shared? And there are a few other questions that I can add in there.
We can absolutely share the toolkit, so we could do that.
Okay, perfect. And then what are your recommendations for increasing the number of people of color working in DCFS? The perception of white saviors is very disturbing to me. That's a question in the chat.
Well, we actually had the benefit here of having a task force that looked at this issue. I believe that report is 3 years old now, it's 2020, that came out of the Children and Family Research Center. They gave some pretty detailed recommendations for changes in recruitment practices, and ensuring that we remove implicit bias from our hiring practices. And a lot of it's fairly straightforward recommendations, like looking at where we do our recruitment and what populations that we're reaching, and ensuring that we are reaching populations where there are historically and currently high levels of marginalized populations. It also talks about the need to be considering intersectionality as part of that. So that report, we reference in our lessons learned report, because they did a detailed job of looking at the population of workers and some very concrete solutions to improving that. It's a slow change because we also have to improve the cultural competency of our staff and our workplaces. We can't improve our balance unless we can retain staff. as well. And so we need to work on both fronts, changing our practices for hiring as well as what we do to ensure that our environments are welcoming and inclusive. You want to add anything to that, Tashina?
I think you added a lot, but I will say that, I mean, that is kind of repeating what Heather said, that there is some strategic planning around one of the things that I had an opportunity to see as I look at disproportionality across the state is that where we see larger numbers of African Americans within a particular community, we see lower levels of disproportionality, and the opposite exists, right? And so this is a conversation that we've been having within the department as we think about strategies, as Heather referenced some of them, on how we engage people of color in some of these roles, important roles, leadership roles, and alike. I think it is very important to something that the slide referenced earlier, right? That the people one of the interviewees said is that there are a lot of white people making decisions for Black children, right? And we don't have enough folks in leadership or on the ground in particular regions to help balance this disproportionality that we are facing with in Illinois.
So thank you. And DCFS has a post-adoptions unit that may be of assistance to adoptive parents. As we move to promote guardianships, what similar resources will be offered?
In that post-adoption unit, they also support the guardianship work too. So it's my understanding that it's not separate, that there's also supports within that particular unit to help with guardianship as well. But let me check into that, Hannah, since that was a question, because I'm almost certain that that happens, those two things happen, even though it's called adoptions unit, that those both permanency, guardianship, and adoption information is stored and captured.
And one more in the chat from Mary. Can you speak more about the Permanency Enhancement Project and community action teams? Who is on the team, and how is as well as how often is the data you were speaking about was shared about them?
So thank you. Every quarter, we work with our partners at Chapin Hall who pull our data. And from that data, share that with university partners across the state. So we have 4 university partners in each region of the state. The community action teams are associated with those university partners, and the university partner takes that data, disaggregates that data, and talks about what they see happening in those particular communities, regions, etc. And from that, those organizations or teams can identify strategies in which they want to put a plan together to address a particular thing that came up in their data. So the uniqueness of it is that we don't tell them what they should be doing. They get an opportunity to look at the community, understand what they see from the data, from the DCFS side, and then make a determination on what strategies or interventions should be put into their particular community to combat a particular concern or an issue. Those community action teams usually have chairs, and they partner with DCFS. So we have chairs kind of on both sides, both the action teams and the DCFS side, so that relationship is a parallel and that information is going both ways. We have a permanency administrator who oversees the project and ensures that we're doing our planning, that those community action teams are doing planning, reporting outcomes. And so this is something that we monitor on a regular basis. Their data is shared with them quarterly to see, how improvements have happened, if they haven't happened, if they need to change kind of strategies. And so hopefully that's helpful. If I didn't give enough information about what the permanency enhancement is, I can provide a brochure as well in the for other documents that have been requested from this presentation.
Okay, absolutely. Okay. This is sort of a comment. I'm just going to read it really quick. Many of our DCFS trainings tend to be very general in nature. I think that racial bias in child welfare work is a very important issue, and would love to see a more detailed, in-depth training on the subject that provides practical information and more details about how we can implement changes in our practice to reduce bias in our work. I know in decisions, I know there are new trainings in the works. Are there plans to have trainings that are more in depth?
Yes, so the race equity curriculum is a training that's specific. Our goal is to have that in an in-person setting. So like our implicit bias training, that is a on-demand web type setting, and individual does it by themselves. We want to be able to do it in a space where we have those difficult conversations, people can lean in, learn from one another. And that is what we're moving to, and definitely to be more in depth, just so that we're not in that, let me click a button and kind of move to the next thing on those trainings, but that we're able to have real robust conversations and kind of get some of those myths, spill some of those myths in the air that create the challenges in working with along with staff as well as with our families.
Thank you. And I cannot see anything. I'm straining so hard. So from Betty Wade, have you studied social service departments that have several tracks, such as an assessment / services track instead of investigatory? Do these systems impact disproportionality?
I can say that our study didn't look at anything like that. The guardianship study was looking at Illinois, and we were very specifically looking at the perceptions of the professionals and the caregivers based on existing administrative data that would show the inequities, but not looking at the differences in equities. I know some of the work you're doing around neglect might have some relevance there, but not the study.
So I think there's a number of different things that we're doing to look at as we look at practice concerns and practice issues. So Hannah, really quickly, the first part of the question was, because I want to respond appropriately.
Yes. Have you studied social service departments that have several tracks, such as an assessment / services track instead of investigatory?
So we have an opportunity. DCFS works with Casey Family Foundations. It's a national organization that supports race equity work and a lot of work in child welfare, but has a race equity lens. And we get an opportunity to learn from other jurisdictions about some of the work that they're doing. So like Heather referenced, we talked about looking at our allegation system. There's a lot of different things that are happening. So this is not service specific, right? This is legislation that we're looking to impact by looking at some of the things that are happening in our other states that have been able to make those changes. We're actually getting ready to roll out the bias-free removal process. So this is affecting investigations. It is service delivery, but we do look at other things that are happening across our country to see what information we can use and take back that makes sense to what we see here in Illinois.
Right. And going back to the in-person training that you mentioned, what was the title of the in-person training you just mentioned, or you mentioned previously? And when did you say that might be?
We don't have a title yet. That's in development stages. And so one of the things, and let me share this, because I direct race equity work, but when I took on the role, I was a one-woman show. And a lot of times I'm talking to a lot of colleagues that I get a chance to see that's doing race equity work, and they don't have a team. And so they want us to do this work, but they don't give us the staff or the supports that's necessary in order to do the work. I was really fortunate last year to get a team started in May. And so we just built our team up to do some of this work, because I have a lot of initiatives that we have going on at the department, but you can't get them all done being a one-person show. So I can't give you a date, but I can tell you that the folks that are putting on there, they got the pressure on them because it's been on my plate for a while. And so the pressure is on them and that's happening through our CWAC community. So one of the things we always want to do is have our partners at the table. When we're having that, we want to have lived experts at the table to deliver that and accommodate some of these times. So as much as I would like to see it done yesterday, we're hoping to have that at least decided on and in place by the end of this calendar year.
Awesome. Thank you. There are two more questions in the chat. Do we know if CWS referrals are made in larger numbers regarding certain racial groups compared to others who may be more likely, who may be more likely to be involved in investigations instead?
We do have that information, but I don't have it readily. I can say this, that our CWS referrals have definitely went up in the last couple of years tremendously, in terms of getting families to the resources they need. In order to talk about it, disaggregatedly, I don't have the number, the information in front of me readily, but Hannah, if I can get that information and share that so that you can share it, that's also something that I can do for you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And what do you see as the long-term positive impacts of doing this work? What hopes do you have?
Let me say this. We understand that child abuse and neglect is real, right? And that we need services and places to combat those. But I will say this, if Black children were proportionally in the child welfare system in Illinois as white children are, we would have 5,000 less Black children in our care. That is a long-term goal that we look for. We look to see the reduction of Black families overrepresented in our system. We look to see more families, Black families, place reunification. Adoption and guardianship is great, but we like to get families back to family. And if they can't be reunified, we would like to see them remain in within their family unit. That is our long-term goal.
You know, there's lots of Dr. Cross has shared a few resources in the chat, and Robin as well. Don't see any other questions. See a clapping of hands.
Well, Hannah, we have wrote down everything that has been requested of us. We'll make sure we get those documents and resources to you shortly.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for all of your work and for presenting for ABSAC, sharing with everyone here.
And we'd like to thank everyone for coming to our presentation. So thank you, everyone. I hope you got something from the information we shared today.
Thank you.